Hello, I'm Oliver Culling, and this is my 70s TV childhood. Hello, and welcome back to my 70s TV childhood. We are a podcast which is aimed at celebrating what it was like growing up in 1970s Britain as a child, and the important role that television played in our and our families' lives back then. If you're new to the podcast, then a very warm welcome to you. And if you're a regular listener, then welcome back. We are now into our 7th season and have released 192 episodes, something which seems absolutely unbelievable, as it only seems like yesterday since we started our regular trips back to the 1970s. We've now had listeners from 151 countries, which is truly remarkable, and our listeners have been listening from over 6,000 towns and cities worldwide. So how did we get here? Well, largely it's been through the loyalty and support of our listeners. I'm absolutely moved by how many of you engage with us as well as listen, and I'm eternally grateful for all your comments and suggestions that you make for the podcast. By the way, if you've recently been in touch and I haven't responded to you, I do apologise. The Christmas holidays and the pressures of my own day job have got in the way a bit, and I do know I owe some of you a response. Somebody did ask me the other day whether we struggled to find ideas for what to feature on the podcast, and I gave them an honest answer, that I think our potential list of topics is virtually endless. Not least because our listeners are always sending in great ideas for what they'd like to see featured. So I hope that means you'll be able to listen to us for a long time to come. Thanks as always to all of you who've been in touch. We had a big response following our pre-Christmas episode looking at popular Christmas toys from the 1970s. Many of you got in touch to say that you had got some of the toys mentioned. Lone Ranger toys were quite popular, it seems. But a number of you, including Mark, Russell and John, asked or queried why the Rally Chopper bike didn't feature in our rundown. Well, to be honest, I don't know the answer, but thinking about it, it's probably because the Chopper was quite an expensive bike relative to some of the others on the market. So perhaps the higher costs meant that fewer were sold than we might think. I never had one, much to my regret, and I'm sure I'm not alone in that. If you did have a Chopper bike, then well done. I am, and continue to be, very jealous. If you'd like to share any of your memories or suggest subjects we might cover in future podcasts, or just say hello, then you can do so in a number of ways. Leave a comment on our blog at www.my70stvchildhood.com or on our social media sites on Facebook, Instagram, X, YouTube and LinkedIn. Or you can also email oliver@my70stvchildhood.com. I read an article recently which suggested that Britain was beginning to feel, well, a little bit like a rerun of the 70s. And this article argues that our current economic woes, international uncertainty and NASA again sending people to the moon, all had a sort of 70s vibe about it. Now I can see that to a point, and I do feel a bit of childish excitement, I have to admit, about the prospect of astronauts going back to the moon after 50 odd years. As we mentioned before, space was massive in the 1970s, so I think I'll be searching out my Brooke Bond T-card book, The Race into Space, to reawaken a few memories of that. But I do think we have to be a bit careful about comparing what we're living through now to the 1970s. It would be very easy to get a bit downhearted about what is going on in the world, with global conflicts and daily uncertainty over what's actually going on. And that is made even more difficult to understand by the unpredictable behaviour of US President Donald Trump. Now, I'm not going to spend any time discussing the merits or otherwise of the 47th President, but he does have a habit of surprising us. None more so when I saw an article in the newspaper just before Christmas about Donald Trump doling out what are known as Kennedy Center Awards. Among the beneficiaries were Gloria Gaynor, Sylvester Stallone and Gene Simmons from Kiss. But one name on the list was a bit of a surprise, and I could only think of one thing when I saw the name Michael Crawford on the list. Now, before listeners start to complain that, of course, Michael Crawford was a big Broadway star, etc., I have to say that for me, he will be forever Frank Spencer. And just hearing that signature tune brings back all sorts of memories for me, and I'm sure for many of you listening. As well as raising a smile, it brings back immense feelings of embarrassment that I felt even as a young child watching the hapless behaviour of Frank Spencer. So for the rest of this episode, we'll be talking about a sitcom that caused nationwide anxiety, made parents wince, and convinced an entire generation of children that adulthood was basically just one long accident. We'll consider all the important questions. Questions like, how did the BBC's insurance department allow this to be made? How did he ever persuade Betty to marry him? And even more incredibly, how did they get to have their daughter Jessica? And how did one person endure so much physical trauma and still live to tell the tale? Yes, it's Some Mothers Do Ave Em. First broadcast in 1973, it introduced us to Frank Spencer, his beret, roll-neck jumper and awkwardness, and Betty, the calm, capable woman who chose to marry him and then quietly spent the rest of her life bracing herself. If you're of a certain age, this wasn't just a programme, this was part of a golden age of British sitcoms. Just take yourself back a minute. 3 channels, 1 TV, and if this was on, you were watching it. Even if you had to cringe sometimes at Frank's action, and your father sat in the corner with a newspaper insisting that he didn't like that silly man. So to my generation, Michael Crawford will always be known as Frank Spencer, which is a bit unfair, I suppose, given, as we just mentioned, he had quite a varied and successful career on stage and screen. Raised by his mother and her parents in a Roman Catholic family, Crawford received his surname from his mother's late first husband, who died in the Battle of Britain before Michael was born. As a child, he moved between an army camp in Wiltshire and the Isle of Sheppey, later living with his maternal grandparents. He attended Catholic school in Bexley Heath, where, according to him, corporal punishment was common. And after World War II, his mother remarried, and the family settled in Herne Hill in South London, where Crawford attended the Oakfield Preparatory School. Crawford began his stage career as Sammy the Little Sweep in his school's production of Benjamin Britten's Let's Make an Opera. Although he was not selected for the role of Miles in Britten's The Turn of the Screw, which went to David Hemmings, later to become one of the actors synonymous with Swinging London, Crawford's impressive audition led Benjamin Britten to hire him in 1955 to play Sammy, alternating with Hemmings, in another staging of Let's Make an Opera at London's Scala Theatre. Credited as Michael Ingram, he recorded the role of Gabe Brooke in an opera conducted by Britten that same year. And in 1958, Crawford was engaged by the English opera group to perform as Japhet in Neuer's Flood, Britten's adaptation of the Chester Miracle play based on the Genesis flood narrative. And it was during this production that Crawford realised his ambition to pursue acting professionally. Between engagements for Let's Make an Opera and Neuer's Flood, he received advice to adopt a new name to avoid confusion with an established television newsreader called Michael Ingram. He subsequently chose Crawford. And it seems like Benjamin Britten was a sort of father figure to the young Michael, and it really was his influence which brought the young actor to the public's attention. Throughout his career, Crawford performed in a diverse range of stage productions, including Andre Mirabeau's Head of the Family, Neil Simon's Come Blow Your Horn, and a whole range of Shakespearean dramas, including Julius Caesar, Coriolanus, and Twelfth Night, and of course later went on to star in Barnum and was the original Phantom of the Opera. Simultaneously, during this time, Crawford contributed to numerous BBC radio broadcasts and appeared in early television series such as Billy Bunter of Greyfriars School, Emergency Ward 10, Probation Officer, and Two Living One Dead. He played John Drake, the cabin boy, in Sir Francis Drake, a 26-episode adventure series produced by ITC starring Terence Morgan and Gene Kent. And Crawford made his film debut in 1958 with leading roles in Blow Your Own Trumpet and Soapbox Derby, both produced by the Children's Film Foundation, an organisation we've mentioned many times in this podcast previously. Now, I do remember the Soapbox Derby film, and I suppose it must have been one of these that was repeated lots of times in the BBC schedules over the years, but until now I never realised that Michael Crawford was one of the stars. Anyway, all of this led to Crawford being perfectly placed to become a well-known film star in the 60s, appearing in films like The Knack and How to Get It, the film version of A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, and The Jokers, where he teamed up with Oliver Reed, playing brothers who were trying to steal the crown jewels. Now, I've seen that film fairly recently, and the thing that comes out of it is both men look so young, and you can also understand why they both had legions of fans. Crawford ended the 60s on a high, as he was in the film version of Hello, Dolly, alongside Barbara Streisand and Walter Matthau. The film was critically acclaimed, but not financially successful, although his reputation was enhanced by being in it. He then starred in the 1971 film version of Alice in Wonderland as the White Rabbit, alongside Fiona Fullerton's Alice. This is another film that used to be shown quite regularly in holiday schedules, I remember. But the rather psychedelic elements of the production seemed to be a bit much for cinema goers, and the film, unfortunately, was a box office failure. So for a while, having been the toast of London, Michael Crawford went through a quiet period. That's showbiz, I suppose. Which came to an end when he starred in the long-running West End farce No Sex, We're British, as the hapless bank cashier Brian Runnicles. This led to an invitation to audition for a new BBC comedy about a childlike and accident-prone man called Frank Spencer. Now, Crawford wasn't the first choice of Frank, as both Ronnie Barker and Norman Wisdom were offered and had turned down the role. But thank goodness he took it on, as it's hard now to imagine Mothers Do Ave Em with anybody else but him in that lead role. So before we look at some of the memories that I've got of the show, let's just go back for a moment to the UK in 1973. Power cuts, 3-day week, tea that could dissolve spoons, shag-piled carpets you could probably lose a small pet in. As we've said so many times on this podcast, we then had television as a shared experience. You didn't disappear into your own room to watch something else. So if Frank Spencer was on, the entire household experienced Frank Spencer together. And the genius of the show was that Frank felt somehow recognisable, even if he was a caricature. Not because we were all like him, but because we all knew somebody with Frank-like tendencies. For our parents, there was always a Frank in the factory or the office, always well-meaning, always keen, always the man who was asked to, well, just leave that for now, Frank, as everyone knew he was incompetent at whatever it was he was trying to do. In every episode of the show, we'd have Frank saying, "Oh, I'll just..." and Betty nervously replying, "Frank, are you sure?" And the audience, already knowing this will end badly, just like it would with a hapless Frank-like character in the factory. Which brings me nicely on to Betty, played by Michelle Detrice. Betty was Frank Spencer's wife. Many of us, even as children, couldn't quite understand what she saw in the childlike Frank, but she was his biggest supporter and stood by him, despite the frequent and often disastrous attempts he made to earn a living or to be a good husband. Betty loved Frank. Properly loved him. Not in a, oh, he'll change sort of a way, but in, well, I'm married to him and this is my life now kind of way. She defended him constantly. To her mother, to neighbours, to employers, to complete strangers, probably to the emergency services as well. But the joke is never on her. She's not foolish. She's capable, calm, and quietly intelligent. Which somehow makes it even funnier when Frank ruins absolutely everything she wants to do, or he wants to do for her. Something rather old-fashionedly British about that relationship. Love expressed through patience, and romance expressed through endurance of your husband. And what about the plot lines? Well, each episode was reasonably self-contained and involved Frank getting involved in a new situation, often getting a new job or trying a new career. Generally, his jobs didn't last beyond an episode, as he was so hapless and helpless, but he never lost faith or confidence in himself. There was a huge amount of physical comedy and pretty impressive stunts, which Michael Crawford did all himself. He was clearly influenced by the silent movies of Buster Keaton and Harold Lloyd as doors, windows and other heavy objects played their parts, falling on him in various disasters. And in part, that's where the cringe factor came in for me, even as a small child. Yes, a lot of the stunts were funny and clever, but the sheer embarrassment of a man so hopeless could be picked up by a 7-year-old and cringed at. So what were your most memorable episodes? I've got a few, although I haven't seen the show since it was originally broadcast, so I may not remember all the details correctly. I believe you can pick up episodes on the BBC's iPlayer, but I haven't done that yet, so I may do so after this episode. An early episode featured the recently wed Frank and Betty going to an old-fashioned hotel at the seaside, where there are a few things in their room which don't quite work properly or are broken. Frank, well, as you can probably guess, decides to do some repairs and put things right, much to Betty's consternation, and his attempts at fixing things lead to furniture being destroyed and ultimately a large hole in either the floor or ceiling, I can't remember which, through which Frank falls. That must be the floor, if he falls through it. Anyway, eventually the whole hotel is disturbed by this wrecking activity, and at the end of the episode, the owner has to close it down for 2 weeks of repairs and renovation. Or what about the one where Frank, out of a job yet again, goes to the labour exchange, where the manager takes him on to help out. Yet again, he manages to destroy most of the building. My personal favourite that I remember is the episode where Frank goes to interview at a holiday camp for a job as camp entertainer. It's notable for a few things, not least having Christopher Timothy as a co-star. Frank does an awful ventriloquist act with a dummy called Marvin, and it's absolutely terrible, and Marvin himself keeps falling apart. He also goes to sing a song for Cabaret, but the song he chooses is one of the ones that we used to sing during folk singing classes at primary school. Early one morning, just as the sun was rising. All of this ends up in a finale where Frank, swinging the microphone lead, rather like Roger Daltrey in The Who, while singing Early One Morning, and setting off lots of fireworks he had strapped to him under his coat, part of his human volcano act. All chaos breaks loose, and the firearm and sprinklers come on. Ever hopeful, Frank finally asks, "Well, have I got the job then?" Another thing that does stand out is the stunts, which we mentioned earlier. Some of the bigger outdoor sequences are really quite terrifying. Famous episodes include Frank trying to learn how to roller skate and breaking out of the roller rink only to be carried along by a bus, dodge various cars and big lorries, and eventually crash through a shop window. I'll tell you what, Michael Crawford must have had some bottle to do all of that himself, and he must have been bruised from head to foot after shooting some of these episodes. And then there were a couple of memorable Christmas specials. In the first one, Frank is the angel of the Lord and crashes up through the church roof eventually and ends up having to be rescued by the fire brigade. And in another, if you remember, he tries to pass his driving test for the 10th time and puts his examiner through all types of scary stunts, including ending up on an airport runway as a plane is landing, before driving off the end of a pier into the sea. Ever the optimist, Frank asks the shaken-up examiner, "Well, have I passed?" Originally, the writer of the show, Raymond Allen, decided that 2 series was enough, and that to do more would weaken the impact of the show. So at the end of the second series, it looked like that would be that, as baby Jessica had finally arrived, and Frank had achieved his long-held desire to be a parent. Incidentally, how Frank had managed to get Betty pregnant always seemed a bit of a mystery given his childlike demeanour, but let's not inquire too closely into that. But viewers had their own ideas, and the BBC persuaded Allen to write another series, which was broadcast in 1978. And you know, I don't think it was as good as the original 2 series. The dynamic between Frank and Betty was altered by the presence of Jessica, and I personally began to find Frank more irritating than ever. Perhaps it was me getting a bit older, but the cringe factor seemed to increase significantly. The show itself was hugely popular and had a special place in our cultural history. I have resisted mentioning it so far, but Frank Spencer was a gift to all impressionists, both professional and amateur, old and young, and he was taken off regularly. "Ooh, Betty, the cat's done a whoopsie in my beret." That was the regular line. Frank was also, I recall, a favourite for fancy dress parties for both adults and children, as all that was required was a trench coat and a beret, and there you had him. And then there was that signature tune. I only have to hear the first few notes, and it raises both a smile and irritates me in equal measure. And did you know, this is quite an interesting fact, that the piccolo tune actually picks out the show's title in Morse code? Quite clever, really. On paper, some Mothers Do Ave Em shouldn't really have worked. One character, one basic joke, repeated frequently and at volume. But it worked because of timing, because of the character, because it had a bit of heart and feeling in it. And much of that was down to the talent of Michael Crawford, supported by Michelle Doutrice. Frank didn't just fail, he failed spectacularly. Every situation escalated beyond all reason. And importantly, though, the show didn't become cruel. We weren't laughing at a stupid man, we were laughing at an unlucky, unfortunate man. A man battling a world that was slightly too sharp, slightly too fast, and a bit unforgiving for him. And deep down, I suppose we admired his perseverance and optimism, even as we watched a building collapse around him. Did you like Mothers Do Ave Em, or did it drive you absolutely crazy? Let us know via one of the ways I mentioned earlier, or just by dropping a line to oliver@my70stvchildhood.com. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for now. We will return in a week's time with our next 70s TV quiz, and in a fortnight with our next regular podcast. Until then, take care, look after those you love, and don't be tempted to take on small DIY jobs around the house if you're not entirely sure of your abilities. Remember Frank Spencer. Ooh, Betty. Do like, rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts, and do join us again soon for more from My 70s TV Childhood.